Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I'm Jessica Roberts, the Business Relationship Manager for NCEA, and I'll be facilitating this webinar today. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A window. We'll monitor the questions and try to get them answered in the allotted time. At the end of the session, I will share a link to an online survey and information on how to receive a certificate of completion for the webinar. Today's webinar, Ask the Psychologist, Your Early Childhood Questions Answered, is brought to you by OSV, our Sunday visitor, and your speaker today is Dr. Joseph White. Dr. Joseph White converted to the Catholic faith while in graduate school at Virginia Commonwealth University, where he received a PhD in clinical child psychology. He later studied Catholic theology at St. Mary's University in San Antonio and has served as a parish director of faith formation for 2 years and worked 7 years in the director of family counseling and family life for the Diocese of Austin, Texas. He now works as an associate publisher for catechetical resources at OSV Publishing and has written 12 books and numerous articles on the catechesis, Catholic education, spirituality, and ministry, including Listening for God in Everyday Life and Companion to the Directory for Catechesis. Thank you for joining us today, Joseph. It's great to have you. Before I turn it over, we're going to go ahead and begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good and gracious God, we pray that the focus and foundation of our Catholic schools will always be the person of Jesus Christ. May we remember that we are called to work together as a part of your church to build your kingdom in our midst. Let each of our Catholic schools, no matter how large or small, whether urban, suburban, or rural, be recognized by its commitment to excellence and efforts to form the whole child and its hospitality to all, and the intentional development in the community of faith, collaboration, trust, and love. Help us to view every aspect of our world through the lens of the gospel and of the teachings of our faith, and let every member of our Catholic school communities become a visible example of what it means to put faith into action. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Dr. Joseph White, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Perfect. I'm excited. I'm just going to put a little anecdote here. I was a preschool director for the Diocese of San Jose, California. I know that's not your webinar, but I love this topic, so I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, it's good to be here, and I thank everyone who's here for the webinar today and everybody who might be watching the recording later. This is a kind of in some ways a repeat of a session that I did at NCEA last year, and I had several requests to do this as a webinar because we had lots of folks that didn't make it into the session. We had a lot of early childhood folks and not enough seats, unfortunately. So if you if that's you, if you didn't make it into that session and are watching this webinar for that reason, I'm sorry that you had to wait so long, but it's great to finally be able to present this to you. And for those of you who didn't see us at the conference last year, happy to be able to present this to you. And for anyone who might have attended that session, hopefully I'll also say some new things today, so you can hear something new as well. I want to just begin by asking a question, because I think this question has some implications for where we will go in this webinar. And the question is this: what is your theory of child behavior? So when I do an Ask the Psychologist session, whether that's for people who work with younger kids like the session today, or the people that work with older kids, a lot of what they have questions about in some way relates to child behavior. What is typical behavior? What do we do when we have behavioral issues, which often, most often, I think, are self-regulation issues in the child that kind of manifest themselves in behavioral ways. But I think it matters why we think kids do the things that they do. And Dr. Ross Green has, kind of a way of phrasing this where he says, really, there are two big camps that people fall into with regard to child behavior. One is children do well if they want to. And so if that's where you are in terms of child behavior, then the objective of managing behavior or somehow regulating kids is to just make them want to do it. So sometimes we'll offer some positive reinforcements, or we might bribe the kids and say, if you do, what you're supposed to do, then you get this. Because it's all about making them want to, or making them not want to misbehave. So if you misbehave, then this terrible thing is going to happen. That's the children do well if they want to kind of mentality. And I think many of us, even if that's not our primary way of viewing this thing, when we take a step back, many of us can fall into that kind of thinking. However, I want to mention, and I'm hoping that you're with me on this, especially those of you who work with young kids, with preschoolers and kindergartners and early childhood populations. What the research is telling us more and more is not children do well if they want to, but rather children do well if they can, or if they think they can. Sometimes they can, but they don't think they can yet. Other times they don't yet have the coping skills or self-regulation skills or impulse control skills to do what we would like them to do. And that's especially true of younger kids who can be in very many different places on the spectrum of development, especially when they first come into a Catholic school. And so I want you to know that I operate, and this webinar today will be from the perspective of children do well if they can, or if they think they can. And so what we'll talk about is, how do we help equip them to have the self-regulation skills to do better? How do we help them believe that they can do better and think positively about that, know that they can do well? So when we talk about what you might frame as behavior problems, or what I might frame as a self-regulation of behavior or emotions issue with the child, that's kind of the perspective that I'll be coming from today. Two important paradigm shifts that I think are especially critical today for early childhood educators. One is moving from seeing social and emotional learning as a program or as specific activities, because we've talked a lot in the last several years about social and emotional learning and trying to build that into our Catholic schools. But I think very often we see it as kind of an add-on or a program or activities that we add in. I want us to move, especially in early childhood, from seeing social and emotional learning as a program or as activities, to a realization that early childhood education centers on social and emotional learning. Really, this is the primary task of early childhood, is learning how to get along with each other, learning how to regulate our emotions, learning how to regulate our behavior, also learning how to regulate our cognitive processes, because that really, all of those things lay the foundation for effective learning in school. So as kids move from kindergarten into first grade and then into older grades at school, we want that to be a firm foundation of good self-regulation and good social skill, so that they can get along well with others, work together in groups, interact well with teachers and other adults in the school environment, and be ready, have a mind that is ready and well equipped to learn. And so because of that, in early childhood especially, I think it's important for us to move away from focusing on academic benchmarks to focusing on brain-based skills development. When we over-focus on academic benchmarks in early childhood, what we're often doing is we're trying to build a house without a foundation. And you know what happens when you build a house without a foundation? It might kind of hold up for a little while, may not stand at all, but it might stand for a little while, and then when it gets shaken up a little bit, it falls apart. That's not what we want to do with our young learners. I mean, the ultimate goal of learning in early childhood is not to know a certain set of facts by the end of pre-K or by the end of kindergarten, but rather to prepare for for several years of learning. And especially for the learning that they'll do in the elementary grades. So, in kind of doing this webinar today, what I would have loved to do, and what I hope maybe I can do at some point, is a live kind of question answer webinar for the whole hour, where I just take your questions and give you the answers. And if you thought that this was going to be that, I apologize. This is an Ask the Psychologist webinar, but the questions have been asked in advance. And the questions were asked when I did a survey of early childhood teachers in Catholic schools at NCEA last April. Um, and so these were some of the questions that people that were most pressing for folks. And if there are additional ones and you want to ask that in the comments on Zoom or things like that, I would love to be able to get to that if I can. But I do find that most times the questions that people ask, even the specific ones, fit into these categories as well. So this is how it broke down. 159 different early educators in Catholic schools across the country were asked, what are your most pressing questions for a psychologist? And these were their answers. The top answer actually was, or the top question was, what are some tools or interventions or resources for specific types of behavior problems? We want actual tools for behavior problems. We'll definitely talk about that today. I think, though, that a corollary question to that is the second one. So that's the last one that you see on screen right now. That was 71 out of 159 said this was a pressing question. But a corollary to that is that second question: how can I help my students grow in self-regulation of emotions and behavior? So how can I give them the skills that they need to be able to regulate themselves better? Um, Also, popular questions were, how can I collaborate with parents around behavioral issues? So how do I talk to them about it? How do I work together with them on it? Especially important in early childhood, of course. Another popular question, according to the research, which elements in an early childhood program lead to later academic success? And so if we're seeing those early childhood years as a foundation for later academic success, what in an early childhood program really helps kids be most successful in those later grades? And we have good answers to that. Research has given us some good answers. And then finally, how can I best meet the needs of a group of students um, that are in different places in their development? How can I best meet the needs of a group of students that are in different places in their development? All right, so let's take a look at these questions a few at a time. So um, in this first section, this really applies to both the emotional and behavioral regulation and specific interventions that I'm going to weave in. So 66 people asked, how can I help my students grow in self-regulation of emotions and behavior? 71 said we'd like specific tools. So hope to give that to you in the next few minutes. So number one, critically important at this age, because we know that this is an age when the emotional area of the brain is really growing. The social and emotional area of the brain, the limbic system, is really developing a lot in these early childhood years. And one thing that's critically important is beginning to forge neural links between the cerebral cortex, which is that area of the brain, and especially the prefrontal cortex, which is going to help regulate those emotions. And so links between that area of the brain and the emotional centers of the brain during this process of development. So affective education becomes very important, and that includes things like identifying feelings in pictures or stories. So as you sit in a circle with your learners who are in pre-K or kindergarten and you're reading stories to them, pause at different times during that story and say, how do you think she's feeling right now? What do you see on her face? So get them to look at the cues in the picture and also the context of the story, and begin to try to understand the feelings of characters in the story. This, of course, is a good way to practice and build skills in empathy towards others, which is a critical social skill to be able to interact well with others. We also want to offer them coached opportunities to share their feelings. So when they're very upset about something, for example, to stand behind that child that's very upset and say, I can see that you're feeling really frustrated. Why don't you tell him how you felt about him grabbing that toy out of your hands? And so coaching that opportunity to share those feelings. And then and I gave you an example of this already too, in that example I just gave, empathic reflection. So being able to look at the feelings that you see on the faces of your students, of your learners, and offer a reflection on that and say, oh, you're very excited about this, aren't you? Or I can see that you're really frustrated, or you're angry about what he just did, aren't you? Or your face is looking sad right now. Tell me about that. So offering those empathic reflections also builds not only awareness of the emotions in the child, but also it models for them empathy towards others, which is especially important as well. Also, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about a couple of other important ways to help students grow in regulation, self-regulation of emotions and behavior. And I'll explain these as I go along. Crisis management of the Hulk, coached problem solving, and then finally, modulation of voice and movement, because we want to help our learners with impulse control and controlling some of those behaviors that can sometimes be a distraction to learning as well. Um, I mentioned with regard to empathic reflection, reflecting the feelings that we see, it serves to help children learn to regulate emotions. It also helps build their emotional vocabulary, so they have labels for those feelings, and helps children develop empathy for others. Now let's talk about crisis management of the Hulk. This comes from the work of Dr. Jed Baker, who wrote No More Meltdowns. And Dr. Baker works a lot with kids that have these really big emotional dysregulation moments. And maybe you've worked with some of these kids as well, because we do get them in our early childhood environments. So those kids that just completely fall apart and have, like the toddler style tantrum, even though they might already be 3 and 4 or even kindergarten age, and sometimes older as well. But those kids are just going to those full blown meltdowns. So what do we do for these kids, and how do we immediately manage the crisis of this major display of emotions? I think one of the things that we're tempted to do is start kind of putting really quick limits on that by saying, hey, if you don't get it together, you're going to lose playground time, or, whatever that might be, because we think that somehow that might motivate them. But, when people are in this full-blown meltdown mode, and this is true about even with adults, what happens is we see in a brain scan the activity in the brain shift from the cortex and especially from the communication areas of the brain or the impulse control areas of the brain. We see the activity there in a brain scan shift from there to the amygdala, which is the fear and anger center of the brain. And so what happens is a lot of our communication centers sort of go offline a little bit. Our impulse control center goes offline, and our emotion center of the brain really lights up with lots of activity. So when we are threatening in the moment, when we are kind of talking kids through consequences or saying this is going to happen or that's going to happen, a lot of times they don't really process what we're saying. And in fact, what's coming out of their mouth may not make a lot of sense either. And you might have experienced this before. Have you ever felt so upset and so caught off guard that you have trouble even getting words out? Or if you do, it doesn't really make sense. And you have to come back and say, I don't know why I said that. The reason why you don't know why you said that is because you weren't really using the best parts of your brain. as you tried to express yourself in that moment. So one of the things that we're not going to find very effective is doing any kind of threatening in that moment. If they do process what you're saying, usually that just ramps up the tantrum, makes it even worse. Um, so we don't want to threaten a child who's having that full-blown tantrum. We do want to use some good nonverbal skills because, again, they're having struggles with processing language, most likely because they're so dysregulated in that moment. So we want to make sure everything that we're doing nonverbally says to them, I'm here to help you. I'm here to help you calm down. It's okay. You're safe. And so what we don't want to do is come at them like this, kind of over their head, coming straight at them. If you think about what, and I don't mean to compare young children to animals, although you've probably done that too before, but I don't mean to do that. But if you think about what an animal might do, if they already feel scared or already feel upset and you kind of come at them like that, that's not the way to approach a dog who's nervous, right? And nor is it, and people are different from dogs, but nor is it the way to approach a child who's nervous or upset or dysregulated. And here's one reason why. Dog brains are mostly limbic systems. That's why they're so emotional and so related, and they just get so excited, and they want to give us lots of kisses when they're excited, and all of those kinds of things. The limbic system in the brain is also very active and growing in a preschool age child, and and yet, when we know when that system is activated, the amygdala is activated with a lot of frustrated, angry energy, coming at them like this is really going to kind of bring out that animal instinct of fight or flight. And often it's fight, sometimes it's flight. And so we don't want to do that with our nonverbals. What we want to do instead is to get beside the child or just behind the child and to, again, instinctually, what we want to do sometimes is get really loud. The child's loud, we get loud. We kind of want to overpower the child in that moment, make them calm down. That's not going to be very effective. I know that that's what you want to do. And in a perfect world, the child should do it, right? But because they might not yet have the self-regulation skills to be capable of doing it, or they might not feel like they can do it, what we want to do instead is send messages, you're safe right now. So we want to bring our voice down. We want to talk more quietly, right? You might say, well, the child's being really loud. Well, what's interesting is sometimes kids that are being really, really loud will get quieter when we get quieter for a couple of different reasons. One is because we have neurons that try to match the tones and the nonverbals of others. And so we tend to get really loud and animated when other people are loud and animated. We tend to get calm and quiet when other people are calm and quiet. So we want to activate some of those matching neurons in the brain of this young child and talk in a very calm and quieter voice. They also find that a little distracting sometimes when they don't know what we're saying and we get calm and quiet. They get a little quieter. It's like, what are they saying right now? So that can be helpful in that sense as well. Finally, it communicates that you're in control. When a child is out of control, the last thing that they need is an adult who's also out of control, because then they feel like they have too much control. Now it's not safe because nobody's in charge here, right? So we want to send the message, hey, I'm in control here. You're okay. This is what we're going to do. So we want to bring that down a few notches. We want to listen. We want to agree when we can. That was really frustrating, wasn't it? You weren't expecting that. That was really frustrating. Apologize when necessary. So something like that might be for a child with poor emotional control. You picked up something that belonged to them without realizing it was theirs and put it somewhere else, or something like they were still working on that. You picked it up or you started putting it away and they've completely now lost control. Um, so agree and apologize might mean, and you might think, oh, no, I shouldn't agree and apologize because they shouldn't be acting that way. You're right. They shouldn't be acting that way. But right now, what we're working on is building their skills to be able to regulate better. So you say, oh, you weren't expecting me to put that up, or, oh, I put this away by accident because that was yours, not his. I'm sorry about that. It's okay. Let's just take a breath here. Another thing that we can do is ask, what is it that you want right now? So say a child is really upset because they wanted to go play with a particular item in the room and another child got it first. They wanted the red ball, but now another child has the red ball. Um, and so they're angry, they're trying to take it away from the child. And you could say, okay, let's sit back. That was frustrating, wasn't it? He got to the red ball before you did, and you really want to play with that. And so maybe the answer to what do you want is I want the red ball. Well, let's find the right way to get that. We can ask him if we can play together with him, or we can say, hey, let's take turns. In 10 minutes, it'll be your turn, but right now it's his turn. Also, when logic is gone, because again, those logic centers can go offline when a child gets very upset. Sometimes it's helpful just to distract. And the younger the child, the more helpful this can be, or the less developmentally mature the child, the more helpful this can be. So the child is very, very upset. We could just take out something really new and different. Disney is masterful at this. I remember going to Disneyland with my goddaughters when the youngest one was probably about 7, but she didn't have great emotional regulation. And so she started really crying and kind of falling apart because she wanted something from the shop that she couldn't get yet. And a costumed character just happened to walk by. They call them cast members at Disney, and bent down on her level and talked to her for a second, gave her a sticker. That was very distracting, and she didn't kind of come back to the tantrum after that because that calmed things down. I've also seen them when like 2-year-olds start crying in line because those lines can be super long at Disney, especially at seasons when you don't want to be waiting outside in line, like in the summertime. I've seen little ones crying in line and cast members come by with little bubble makers and blow bubbles, and all of a sudden they're distracted and they're popping the bubbles. So distracting with novel items. Um, uh, Looking at the special interests of the child. And this is especially true with a particular population that can sometimes have some self-regulation issues. Those kids who are on the autism spectrum very often have some focused special interests. And so when they are upset and dysregulated, going right to their special interests sometimes can be helpful for them. Um, and then using other kinds of sensory activities, Play-Doh or other kinds of sensory materials. Maybe perhaps you have a sensory table in your classroom where you put rice or dried beans or something like that kids can play in. Also, sand is good for those tables, but not very good for the carpet. So sometimes people stick with rice or beans instead of sand for those sensory tables. Um, you also want to make a plan for next time when you're crisis managing the Hulk. Interview, observe, keep a journal, see if you can determine what tends to set off these moments, these big tantrums. How can we modify some of those triggers, and how can we increase the ability to cope with some of those triggers, or do a little skills training with the child? Here are some typical triggers, though, for those kids that have sensory regulation issues. Um, you know, this is true with babies, and it's also true with older kids. It's true in early childhood. When there are some internal issues, like the child is hungry, they're tired, they're sick, that can trigger these self-regulation issues. For some kids, sensory issues, noise, light, touch, overstimulation, boredom, a lack of structure. Preschool age kids need structure. They need to know what to expect in order to feel safe. Challenging or new work, for kids that aren't very confident in their abilities or might have some developmental delay. A challenge is a time that they sometimes have a meltdown because it makes them anxious. Am I going to be able to do this? Having to wait, not getting what they want, feeling disappointed can be typical triggers. We all have to learn how to deal with that, but it's a process with many kids. Threats to self-esteem, losing, making mistakes, being criticized. Can be a trigger. Unmet wishes for attention can be a trigger, although we tend to overestimate this. We tend to think that kids are acting up just because they want attention when sometimes it's other things as well. But this can also be part of it. Um, Feeling ignored or wanting others to laugh. Kids that are chronically ignored except when they're misbehaving start misbehaving more because everybody wants to be noticed, right? And so it can be an unmet need for attention that plays into this as well. One of the things that I teach teachers that I work with and have in psychology practice in the past, also done a lot with kids, is just a little system called 1, 2, 3 check. And 1, 2, 3 check mimics what happens in the prefrontal cortex, or the impulse control area of the brain, or executive functions area of the brain. And 1, 2, 3 check is just 3 steps and a check. And it's something we can use again and again with lots of different situations. Step one is, what is the problem? Because unless we identify the problem accurately, we're not going to be able to make good choices about a good solution. So number one, what is the problem? Number two, what are my choices? Many kids do the first thing that pops into their head, right? So, this child took a toy away from them. The first thing they think of is, I'm going to hit him. And so they hit him, and now they're in trouble, right? So as they did the first thing that popped into their head. So what are my choices helps kids to sit and begin to think about, what are all the different things I could do in this situation. Take the best action. So then, we choose what choice is likely to work best. And then finally check and see, how did it work? Now, is it a reasonable expectation that a preschool or kindergarten age child will learn these steps and then put them into practice? No, that is not a reasonable expectation. Maybe a school age child will. And in fact, we use this a lot for kids that are in, second, third, fourth, fifth grades. We teach them these steps, and it's been shown to be 80% effective in improving behavior in kids and behavioral self-regulation in kids with ADHD. With preschool age kids, though, what we've got to do is we need to memorize those steps, and then we coach them through situations with those steps in mind. What's going on here? Tell me about what's happening. That's the what is the problem. Number two, what are my choices? Oh, let's think, what are some different things you can do? See if you can get them to do that, but if not, prompt them with some different things. Now, what do you think is the best thing to do? How should we handle this? That's take the best action. And then after they do that, we check and see, okay, so how did that work out? Is everything going okay now? Do we need to think of something else to do? So that's how you use 1, 2, 3 check with preschool age kids. One of the things we want to teach them in terms of behavioral self-regulation is how to modulate their voices and their movements, right? Because kids at this age are still really learning how to do that. They're still getting a sense of that. And there are games that we can play that help them learn how to do that better, that just sort of build their voice and movement modulation muscles, if you will, in their brain. So one game I play with preschoolers to help work on this is called Kleenex drop, or it can also be a handkerchief or even a silk scarf or something like that. Something that you can drop from high in the air that will sort of float as it comes down slowly, okay? So what you do when you play Kleenex drop, and this is most fun when you have a whole room full of kids, is when you drop it up here, everybody's being noisy. Everybody's going crazy. Let them do it a little bit, okay? Because we're going to learn how to modulate that. When it's falling, they're blah, 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 blah. And then when it gets to the ground, they have to be completely quiet. That's how you play the game. So we're learning how to just switch that off when we need to switch that off in response to a cue. because that's important, right? We need to be able to come in from the playground outside and now calm down and calm our voices and calm our bodies, right? We need to be able to switch from a transition time where we're very active in the room and running around the room and having some fun, or going from center to center in the room, to a circle time where we need to be able to be quiet. So because we want them to learn that skill, Kleenex drop can be one way to do that. For voice modulation, Hello Sam is just a game where we're asking the children to repeat "Hello, Sam" after we say it, but they repeat it in the same way we say it. So we might do some where we're loud, "Hello, Sam," and we might do some where we're quiet, "Hello, Sam," and we might do some in funny voices, "Hello, Sam," "Hello, Sam." But back and forth, and we're teaching them how to pay attention, how to do self-monitoring, because we can't regulate ourselves until we monitor ourselves. So we're teaching them how to pay attention to what they're doing, what their voices are doing, and then modulate their voice to match what we're doing, right? It always helps with these games if you end on a quiet note, if you're trying to transition into a quieter activity. So make sure your last "Hello, Sam" is even a whisper, "Hello, Sam," like that. Elevator is a modulation of movement game. So what you do in Elevator is you hold hands with a child facing the child, or children hold hands with each other, almost like they're doing London Bridge, but this one is an elevator. And you say, okay, this elevator, when it's on the bottom floor, is very still and very quiet. When it's on the first floor, it gets a little rickety and shaky. And so it moves around a little bit and it's a little noisier. When it's on the top floor, it's super fast and super shaky and super noisy, right? And so what you're going to do then is call out to the kids, okay, middle floor, okay, top floor. And then they're going crazy. And then you say, bottom floor. Everybody sits down and they're very still. Middle floor, they stand halfway up and they're moving around a little bit. Top floor, they stand all the way up and they're really moving around. So you're going back and forth between the floors, teaching them how to modulate their movement. Also, you can modify "Simon says" to be "teacher says." And so what they're doing is just playfully learning how to respond to your directions in the correct way, how to listen to what you're saying, and how to change what they're doing to fit what you're asking. Okay. So "teacher says," you could do "teacher says climb a rope," and they pretend to climb a rope. "Teacher says row a boat," and they sit down and they're rowing. "Teacher says swim." "Teacher says hop." "Teacher says jump." So just a playful way for them to learn to respond to your directions and regulate themselves based on the directions you're giving them. Okay, next question. How can I collaborate with parents around behavioral issues? What we want to do here is do both facilitation of collaborative conversation, and then also, I think it's helpful after that initial conversation to use a simple and effective and goal-based mechanism to track what's happening beyond that. So are the things that we agreed on actually then happening? So when we're facilitating collaborative conversation, here's what I think is really important to do. Number one, it's really important. When I say early intervention here, I know early childhood professionals, when they think of early intervention, have one thing in mind, but I'm just talking about in these situations. So when we realize there's an issue with a child, we want to intervene early in that issue. So as soon as we see a pattern of problems with behavioral regulation, problems with emotional regulation, or other things that are causing issues for the child, for the kids, for the other people in the classroom, we want to try to tackle that as soon as possible. Do not wait to talk to the parent until we're almost ready to say this child has to leave the school, has to leave the class. Don't wait until then. We want to intervene much earlier than that and give them a chance to grow and to gain the skills that they need. So early intervention, we want to probably wait until we can at least see it's a pattern. So not, the first time we see an issue happen, unless the issue is very serious. But then also we don't want to wait until it's so much of a pattern that we feel like they've got to go. Early intervention. Number two, when you have that conversation with parents, start with a positive. So, parents, and especially first-time parents of young children, they are wired to really, really be defenders of their child, right? And to see the best in their child, or at least we hope that's true. Because kids need cheerleaders, right? They need somebody to that they are their superstar, right? And so we've all had this experience of, and I have as a child psychologist, I'm sure you have as a teacher had this experience of giving difficult feedback to parents and them saying, "Oh, that doesn't sound like my child," or "My child wouldn't do that." Right. And you're thinking, I watched your child do that. So I know that they would do that. Um, but, uh, but I think one of the things that softens that initial defensive reaction of the parent is to start with something positive so that they know this isn't just an adult who only sees the bad in my child or who has labeled them in some way. They also see my child's strengths. So you want to make sure that you've observed this child long enough to also see some good things about them. Start with the positive. Then we want to give specific examples of the behavior that we're concerned about. Communicate concern for the child, right? The parent, probably if they're empathic and they're good people, they're going to care that this makes things hard for you and for the other kids, but they're going to care most about the effect that it has on their own child, right? So we want to communicate concern for their child and then take a collaborative stance. So let me give you an idea of how this might work. Just walk you through an example conversation. Okay. So say that we have 5-year-old Peter in a pre-K or kindergarten class. I'm going to call him Peter because I think Peter is the patron saint of ADHD. Think about it. You'll agree with me, I think. So 5-year-old Peter is in this class, and we've noticed a lot of issues. He's very impulsive, very dysregulated in the class. Um, so we're going to start with the positive. So we might say something like, you know, Peter has so much energy and he comes into the class with so much enthusiasm, so much energy. He's always ready to be first to jump right into whatever we're getting ready to do. And you're thinking sometimes he jumps in a little too soon, but you're not going to say that yet. And then you're going to say, we appreciate that kind of energy. I want kids to come in ready to jump into the activities. I want them to be happy and have lots of energy. Um, so you've said some good stuff. Then you're going to go to some specific examples of concerns. And I would say use 2 or 3 specific examples. If you only give one example, there'll probably be some good excuse for it. Oh, he did that because we were out at his grandma's house too late the night before. He didn't sleep like he should have, or, something like that. So give 2 or 3 examples from different times. And then you want to communicate concern for the child. You want to say, so say, for example, the examples are, sometimes when we're sitting down for circle time, he's not really watching his body and he ends up getting in other people's space and it's making his peers react negatively toward him and I want him to feel good about his friends in this class. I want him to get along well with them and for him to feel like he's got some strong friendships here. So you're communicating concern for the child. Or you might say sometimes when we're starting an activity, he starts kind of grabbing the materials and using them before he's listened to my directions. And then he feels really frustrated because it didn't go together the right way. And I want him to feel successful. So again, you're communicating concern for the child. And then after you give those examples, communicating concern for the child, then you take a collaborative stance. You say to them, something like, what are some ways that you do you see this also at home? And if you do, what are some ways you work on it at home? Or, what can we do together to help him grow in this area? Because I'd really like to see him be able to grow while he's with me in this class. So you're taking that collaborative stance with the parent. Also, we talked about using a simple, effective, goal-based tracking vehicle. So, it might look a little bit like this, or it might be simpler than this. This is one I use with young kids, but usually younger elementary kids. So you could modify this a little bit with, some smiley faces and faces that, just kind of have straight mouths or something like that. But what we're doing here is we're trying to increase self-monitoring in the child. Remember, we can't regulate our behavior until we learn how to monitor our behavior. So we want kids to pay more attention to what they're doing, right? And so we might just have one goal that we're working on, or maybe two at most, but probably one. The younger the child is, the more we need to focus on a singular goal. So rank order the things that you want the child to be able to do better at, and then say, which one of these. So make a list. You're going to rank order it. So whichever one of these is most pressing, that's the goal we're going to work on this week. Maybe it's a safety goal, like you need to stay in the classroom when we're in the classroom, right? So maybe our goal the first time is just staying in the classroom. Maybe our goal is when you're frustrated, you keep your hands off other people. You're using your words instead of your hands and your feet, right? So that might be the goal. But we're going to have one goal that we focus on. And each day, we're going to prompt that child to watch his or her behavior, and probably multiple times during the day. So while we're on the playground today, I want you to really pay attention to, when I get frustrated, am I using my words instead of using my hands and feet with people? Right. So you're going to prompt them. And then afterwards, you're going to check in with them and say, okay, so how did you do? And at the end of the day, we'll have a big check in where we say, okay, so how do you think you did on your goal? And maybe we're rating it with faces instead of numbers, because it's hard to quantify that with younger kids, right? So maybe we're rating it with faces. Did you do smiley face? Did we do the straight across face? Did we have a lot of trouble? Maybe we want to rate the sad face. So let them give their rating first, and then you give your rating. And if the ratings agree, then hey, that's great. You agree. Even if the rating was, we were kind of in the middle. I did a little better, but some of the time I didn't do well, right? If they can notice that, that's progress. Because when we learn how to monitor ourselves better, we can learn how to regulate ourselves better, right? So we want to give them some good positive reinforcement for that. But we also want to say, so how can we do better next time? Maybe tomorrow we're going to focus on making this a smiley face day, right? I've also seen people use color systems as well. The main thing is, though, that this needs to be personal between you and the child and the parent, and not sort of up on a chart for everybody in the room to see, because all that does is it ends up making the kids who have the most struggles with this sometimes feel even more defiant or more challenged. And so having it up there for everybody's consumption probably isn't a great way to work on goals. Um, okay. Let's go to the next question. We're getting to the end of our hour, so I want to make sure that I have a chance to cover this as well. According to the research, which elements in an early childhood program lead to later academic success? So what are the things that really help us be successful later? Is it making sure that we get into the pre-algebra when we're still in kindergarten, or is it something else? Three things: child-initiated models, active learning, and multisensory approaches. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Um, there's been lots of research over the last 20 years about the difference between academic models, child-initiated models, and middle-of-the-road models. That kind of way of dividing those up was part of the original research Rebecca Marcon did at the University of North Florida, and since then that's been repeated in different ways all over the world, looking at, an academic model is one where kids mostly sit at tables or in desks, and they're mostly doing things like worksheets and workbooks, or very structured work on a computer even. But it's teacher driven. First we're going to do this, next we're going to do this, next we're going to do that. That's an academic model. It's a preschool model that looks a little more like a grade school model for many grade school kids. And then a child-initiated model is completely different. It's one where kids come in and they guide themselves through their learning. So there might be a class meeting at the beginning of the day, or at the beginning of the half of the day, where we meet in a circle and we talk about what's in each learning center. Those learning centers are structured. This is not an unstructured approach. That's not a good child-initiated model. So it's not just, a bunch of stuff in a room and kids come in and have at it. It's not like that at all. But very structured learning centers, fine motor center, block center, pretend play area, sensory area, pre-writing center where they have some paper and some models of letters and opportunity to make letters. So we talk about what's in each center, how many people can go in each center. We allow them, to get up a few at a time and select their first center, and then there'll be periods of time where they change. But in effect, what they're doing is they're self-selecting the centers, and then they're guiding themselves through the learning process with some facilitation by the teacher. That's a child-initiated approach. Now, what we are finding in the research over the last 20 years all over the world is the results are the same. The child-initiated approach to preschool education far and away leads to better outcomes. And we see the biggest difference when kids move into the fourth grade. And that's why sometimes we failed to see the difference, because we see the biggest difference about 5 years, 4 or 5 years later, when kids are moving into fourth grade. And why is that? Because in fourth grade, learning becomes a lot more self-managed, self-regulated, right? So learning, because, they have to read independently, they have to work at their desks independently, much more beginning in the fourth grade. The kids who in preschool and in kindergarten had child-initiated environments where they guided themselves through their learning, they developed the hardware in the brain, the architecture that was necessary for self-directed learning later. Now, if people can't engage in self-directed learning, if they can't really monitor themselves and guide themselves through a learning process, then they begin to fail, and especially beginning in the fourth grade. That self-directedness is so important all the way through college, to be able to do that. And that's what we're finding. Christie and Roscoe's, Whitebread and Bingham, Marcon, Elkind, these are studies done at some of the most prestigious and well-respected institutions of higher learning and early childhood programs like, the one at Yale University, Tufts University, Cambridge in England. Over and over and over, we find workbook and worksheet driven programs are not how young kids work best. And that approach might even hinder learning, because what we're finding is it makes kids more negative about learning to do this stuff in preschool. They tend to dislike learning activities as they get older. So what do we want to do? We want to look for ways to help children use all of their senses in learning. That engages their attention. It makes learning fun. And there are good models for doing that. The high scope model is an excellent model for preschool and kindergarten that really draws on this research and creates a very structured but child-initiated environment that does exactly what I'm talking about. That's Highscope, Highscope, if you're interested in looking more into that. That's just one model, and I don't get any commission from them, but that's one model that I think is very good. So child-directed activities have been shown to be the most effective in learning new content in early childhood and maintaining a positive attitude towards learning. I've already talked about how we might, implement that kind of approach. Um, uh, how can I best meet the needs of a group of students that are in different places in their development? Child-initiated learning, again, is really helpful for that. Also, having a responsive classroom and brain-based neurosensory strategies. I'll talk a little bit about this, and then I know we'll have to wrap up because we're getting to the end of our hour. But in a responsive classroom, we want to facilitate collaboration between the kids in our class. In our class, we help each other is the message, right? So does every time a child needs help with something, does the teacher or the adult in the room have to be the one to provide that help? No, because kids are in different places in their development. And it's very beneficial for a child who is able to or has mastered a developmental milestone to help a child who hasn't yet mastered that. That teaches the child who's developmentally ahead some empathy. It also kind of cements a skill that they still are learning, but it also is good for the other child, especially to see, from somebody closer to being a peer, that this is possible for kids to be a little more independent, to not always depend on the adult. And so especially in mixed age groups, older learners can help younger ones. In same age groups, it's important to identify talents and areas of need and pair those students together in activities accordingly so that we know everybody has a chance to shine, but that everybody also gets the help that they need. Um, I wish that I had time to really go into brain-based strategies and neurosequential development, and maybe that's going to be another workshop for later because I know we're really getting to the end of the hour, and so I'm gonna probably pause here on that topic. And these are just some practical things that we can do to build some of these areas of the brain that help us to be more flexible, help us to um, uh, uh, get more regulation in terms of sensory and behavioral approaches. I'll tell you what I will do is I'll pass these notes along to Jessica so that you have these lists of particular activities that will help build those skills. And then that way you'll have that information, and maybe we can come on and do a sequel to this at some point and talk a little bit more about that. In closing, I just want to thank you for your attention today. I also want to mention that along with a wonderful team of early childhood educators, authored a child-directed approach to religion class. It's an early childhood religion program that really takes the research that I mentioned about child-directed, child-initiated activities and puts that into a religion program. So this is not a workbook-based program, but rather a hands-on active learning approach to learning about God and about the church. And so if you'd like to see a sample of that for your school, you can just select this QR code here and fill out the sample request form. Whenever OSV sends free samples to people, they really are free samples. We never make you send them back or send you a bill. Or I used to be afraid to get a free sample, because people would ask for it back. We don't do that. We would like you to just be able to see this. There are hands-on multisensory activities for every lesson. There's a 5-day lesson plan for every chapter so that Catholic schools and weekday preschools already have it broken down. How do I use this throughout the week? Liturgical year correlations. The YouTube address that's on your screen is where you can see an unboxing of our Alleluia kit so you can see what's in there and how to use that. So I encourage you to check that out, and it's free to check it out. So why not? If you request it, you'll probably just get the teacher guide. So be aware that there are a lot of other kinds of things that come in the big box. There's a song for every lesson that's on a CD that comes in there and also downloadable from the website. There are magnets that you use to tell the stories, all that kind of good stuff. But thank you again for your attention today. I hope that this was helpful, and maybe we'll do a part 2 sooner or later.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. It was great having you on. And thank you for anyone who attended today's webinar, either virtually, or I'm sorry, all virtually, but either live here online with us or watching the recording back. NCA continually we love to continue striving to improve the quality of our services for members based on feedback. We'd love for you to input and inform our future work and improve our services. So if you could go ahead and complete the survey, it shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. And at the end of it, you will receive a certificate of for attendance. And just make sure that the email that you use when you complete the survey is accurate and up to date, because that will send it automatically. Thank you again, Doctor.
Thank you, Jessica.
Everyone have a great rest of your week.